I think that the key in a lot of ways is greater economic diversification. I think that the state generally, Bend in particular, are poster boys for an economy that is too dependent upon too few sectors. It seems like Bend went historically from a town dependent upon timber exclusively, or nearly exclusively, to a town overly dependent upon residential home construction and the sort of frothy real estate speculation that we saw earlier. So it went almost directly from those with little in between, and I think that we should encourage a more healthy and broad-based economy for more and better jobs that support families and will strengthen the community long term. I also, and I can be more specific about that too, I also think that the first step is to not repeat some of the same mistakes that we've made in the recent past. I know from talking with thousands of people all over the community, we've been canvassing like crazy for 6 months or more, knocking on doors, thousands of doors all over town, that a lot of people are hurting in their mortgages. A lot of them are underwater or facing foreclosure proceedings. And I would not like us to sit there blow by blow, day by day, and look at every little tick in the housing market and construction and so forth. Those are important sectors of the economy. I'm not going to belittle construction and real estate. They're obviously important sectors of the economy, and a lot of people employed in them here. But for us to just focus on that is, I think, repeating the same errors that got us into the situation that we were in a few years back, overly dependent upon too narrow an economy. As a second example of not repeating the same mistakes and at least learning from the recent past, step number one, on regulation, and my opponent Jason alluded to this, and often they will talk about regulatory burden. Frankly, a big part of the contributing factor from the national and state perspective, and I think some from the local perspective, is the very opposite. It was deregulation. It was the lack of the proper regulations that had the proper protections in place, for instance, for the underpinning of our financial systems. When we had that big party and free ride, it was not over-regulation, but rather the lack of proper regulations that resulted in the stock market crash and the financial problems that have trickled all the way down to the state and local levels. So while I don't think our regulatory burden should be onerously complex, I agree with Jason, for small businesses, especially local small businesses and individuals with the best of intentions to navigate. I do think that we need to have the regulatory protections that we have in place that have been hard to put in place and a lot of careful thought put there to protect our environment, to protect our health and safety, OSHA regulations. I don't think a dangerously deregulatory fervor is what we need. It's going to repeat some of the same mistakes. Moving forward, I think the key to strengthening our economy and more jobs is all about infrastructure. And I like to think about this maybe a little bit differently than people do traditionally. People think about physical infrastructure and the challenges that we have. God knows we see it locally. You can't even drive around town anymore. Roads and roundabouts and curb ramps going in and so forth, but it's not just transportation and physical infrastructure. Obviously, it's utilities and communication and other aspects of our physical infrastructure that we are well behind on in this district because we haven't caught up, we haven't kept pace with the growth that we've seen, and it's going to take us a long, long time to climb out of that physical infrastructure hole that we've dug for ourselves. But how do I think about this differently? I also think about social infrastructure as a key piece to recovering the economy and jobs. What do I mean by social infrastructure? It's education and it's healthcare, primarily. I think we are taking some initial positive steps on the healthcare front. I think the Affordable Care Act from the federal level was an important first step. It's not perfect. I think that the state is forward-leaning even ahead of that. On education, briefly, our schools are hurting. Education funding has to be a priority, and that is not just sufficiency but stability of our education funding. I do agree that one of the brightest spots locally, one of the most exciting things that we have locally, is the expansion of OSU Cascades to a full four-year university. it has amazed so many of us, myself included, that you've got towns in Oregon like Ashland and Monmouth and LeGrand. If you add the populations of those three towns together, you don't come close to our population. And yet they all have their own independent universities. We haven't had one here. It's been a gap for many, many years, and many people have been working toward the expansion of OSU Cascades. That will be a huge piece. I think it's very positive. Very quickly, then I would say some more contrast, because you guys are interested in contrast. In my campaign, and once in the legislature, I will focus on working people and families in Bend and in Oregon. I don't think we need as much focus on the wealthy and on large corporations. We've tried trickle-down or philosophies that are tightly related to trickle-down for the past 30 years. They haven't worked. They've been catastrophic. So when I hear talk about, inheritance taxes, we need to get rid of those, or capital gains taxes, they're too high, or the corporate kicker opposing retaining that revenue for schools and education. And Jason just said a moment ago, and I'm quoting here, businesses are the foundation of our economy. I think working people are the foundation of our economy. And so our focus is going to be different in that regard. I'm tired of trickle-down. We've tried it, it hasn't worked.
I don't know what Nathan's talking about, trickle-down economics, and I'm not sure that a lot of his remarks had anything to do with contrast between him and me. I took a lead role on education reform in the last 2 sessions of the legislature. Took a lead role in the end of 2011 after the session. In 2012 when we passed our healthcare reform. And I do agree, and I appreciate the comment, that Oregon is out on the leading edge of healthcare reform and trying to find a way to change that system to emphasize more prevention and wellness and reduce the unsustainable cost increases in healthcare costs that we are all suffering from, including the state, but also private citizens and employers. So, I think in terms of his comments about working families and trying to create some kind of inference about the wealthy and corporations, it doesn't really serve any particular purpose. If a person starts a business, that doesn't make them wealthy. That makes them entrepreneurial. It makes them willing to take a risk to try to do something, I think, usually that is a dream of theirs. If a person owns a farm, that doesn't make them wealthy. It doesn't make them any less of a working person than you or me. If a person has a job and they're supporting their family and they're working hard to keep that job in a tough environment, that doesn't mean they work any less hard than an entrepreneur. I mean, this is not an us and them environment. People who own businesses in this state and people who had jobs are all struggling. And the idea that the economy can somehow be broken down, and try to segment people who we should blame, and look backwards and hand around this kind of divisive rhetoric about it's all the fault of this person, it's all the fault of this kind of person, is absurd. I think it's time that we started looking forward at what will work to enable people to have opportunities, and whether that's in business or whether it's as a public servant or whether it's as a teacher, whether it's as an employee of a small newspaper company. I don't care what it is, but there are things that we can do to raise the level of opportunity in this state. And if we try to do this rhetorical nonsense, and we fail to look outside of Oregon at what we're competing with and work together to find those ways to encourage economic activity in whatever form, then what we're doing is we're continuing to do the same thing that we've done for a long time, which is to try to vilify economic activity.
I'm going to cut in right there.
And it's a mistake.